The slap landed before anyone in the room could process what they were seeing. The sound of it cut through the low hum of the ventilation system, sharp and clean, and then the room went absolutely still. Luciana Moretti Vitale, a woman with dark hair pinned back and a frame that certain members of this family had called generous, in the way people used that word to mean something else entirely, had just struck Dante Vitale, the head of the Vitale family, and the man whose name alone was enough to close a room's conversation, because he had set a pen down on a divorce document without once looking at her face. Every bodyguard in the room went rigid. 2 men near the door moved their hands toward their jackets and stopped mid-motion, waiting for an order that did not come. Silvio Vitale was the first to find his voice. He stood at the far end of the long mahogany table, a man with good posture and better suits, and the particular stillness of someone who had already decided what was going to happen before the meeting began. "Get her out," he said, and the words were calm in the way that a very controlled person stays calm when something has gone differently than planned. 2 of the guards started forward. Dante raised one hand, a single small gesture, and both men stopped as if they had walked into glass. Nobody spoke. The room's air conditioning continued to breathe steadily into the silence while Dante stood with one hand still resting near the unsigned divorce paper, the red mark of Luciana's palm coming up slowly along the left side of his jaw. 37 minutes earlier, Luciana had been standing in the hallway outside this room telling herself that whatever happened inside, she would remain calm. He looked at her then, not with the cold fury she had expected and had already prepared herself for during the 3 steps it had taken her to cross the room, not with the calculated blankness he had used on her for 3 years, the expression she had come to think of as his default setting around her, the face of a man who had agreed to something inconvenient and was making the best of it. He looked at her with something she could not name, something that did not fit inside the architecture of any moment they had shared before this one, and that unreadable quality of his gaze was, somehow, more frightening than anger would have been. Luciana did not step back. She was 31 years old and had spent a significant portion of those years learning to hold very still inside situations that were larger than her, and she called on that training now. "I will not sign anything today," she said. The words came out level, which surprised her. Her palm was still warm. "And neither will you." She looked at the document on the table, then back at him. "Not like this." Silvio cleared his throat. Luciana, her name in his mouth, always had a texture to it, smooth on the outside and something harder underneath. "You have been a part of this family for 3 years. We have treated you well. This arrangement has simply reached its natural conclusion, and the terms being offered are more than fair." He gestured toward the paper as though he were explaining something simple to someone who needed things explained slowly. "Elena Carucci's family brings a partnership that benefits everyone. You must understand that." "I understand perfectly." She pulled her eyes away from Dante and looked at Silvio directly, which she almost never did, because Silvio's eyes were the kind that catalogued, "I understand what I am and what I have always been in this family, but I will not be dismissed inside a room full of witnesses and told that this is a natural conclusion." She reached out and turned the divorce document over so its face lay against the table. "If this is happening, it will not happen today." The silence stretched. Luciana felt it against her skin, the weight of 17 people in the room, all collectively holding their breath, and she thought, not for the first time, about how much of the last 3 years had been exactly this, a room full of people waiting to see what Dante Vitale would do, with her somewhere at the edge of that equation, a variable nobody had bothered to solve for. She had arrived in this family at 28 years old, with a surname that meant a debt had been paid and a ring that meant the debt was cleared, and she had moved through 3 years of dinners and silences and separate bedrooms and the particular loneliness of being present at every table and absent from every conversation that mattered. She had learned to make herself small in rooms where people wanted her smaller. She had learned to read the temperature of a silence before she spoke into it. She had not planned to slap him. She had walked into the room this morning thinking she would be asked to sign something, and she had prepared herself to do it with dignity, to take whatever settlement was offered and go build a life from whatever remained. She had not planned for the thing that had risen in her chest when she saw the pen already in his hand, the document already open, the whole machinery of this ending already in motion, without a single conversation, without even the courtesy of being looked at. She had not planned for any of it. And yet, here she stood. Dante had not moved. The red mark along his jaw had settled into its shape. He was a large man, not in the way that announced itself, but in the way that made rooms feel proportioned around him. And he stood with the kind of stillness that came not from constraint but from absolute certainty about where his body was in space. He looked at her for another long moment, and then he said, very quietly, "Everyone out." Silvio did not move. "Dante, I think it would be better if we, everyone." The word did not get louder. It did not need to. The room emptied in a way that reminded Luciana of sand running through a hole. Silvio was the last to go. He paused at the door, and in the second before he pulled it closed behind him, he looked at Luciana with an expression that registered somewhere in the back of her mind as something to think about later. Not contempt, which she had received from him freely for 3 years and had catalogued and set aside. Something else, something that moved, that had a direction to it, like a compass needle settling toward a target she could not yet see. Then the door closed, and she was alone with Dante Vitale for the first time in, she counted backward, honestly, 11 weeks. He moved then, picking up the divorce document and setting it to one side without looking at it, as though it were a menu he had already decided against. He walked to the window. The city below them was a Tuesday morning in late September, all motion and indifference, and he stood with his hands loose at his sides and his back to her. "You should have been told before this meeting," he said. The words were not an apology. They were not quite an explanation either. They were simply a statement, the acknowledgement of a fact. And that was, she recognized, as close as Dante Vitale came to saying he was sorry. "Yes," Luciana said. "I should have." He turned. Whatever had been in his expression before had been replaced by something more familiar, the closed and careful face she knew better. "You will be provided for. The terms in that document were written to." "I did not ask about the terms." He stopped. She looked at him across the empty room, across 3 years of a marriage that had existed mostly as a legal category, and she felt something settle inside her. Some decision she had not consciously made, but that her body had apparently already arrived at. "I am not leaving this building today," she said. "I am going to my room, and we are going to have a different kind of conversation than this one, at a time that is not decided entirely by your brother." She bent and picked up her bag from the chair beside the door. "When you are ready for that conversation, you know where to find me." She left. She kept her head up and her pace even, and she did not look back. She did not let herself feel the shaking in her hands until she was in the elevator with the doors closed. In the polished metal of the elevator walls, her reflection looked back at her jaw set, color high in her cheeks, hair still neat despite everything. She studied that reflection for the 12 floors between the boardroom and her own level, and she had the strange thought that this was the first time in 3 years she recognized the woman looking back at her. Downstairs, a man she did not recognize stepped out of the shadow near the building's side entrance and spoke quietly into the earpiece he was wearing. He was not wearing the dark suit that marked Vitale security. He was not someone she had seen before. He looked in the direction of the elevator bank, then looked away, and she was already past him before the significance of his posture registered. The particular alertness of a person whose job is to watch and not be seen watching. On the 31st floor, in the room that had once been a boardroom and was now empty, Dante Vitale stood at the window for a long time after the door had closed. He touched the side of his jaw once, briefly, then dropped his hand. He looked at his phone, at a message from a number that did not have a name attached to it in his contacts. 3 words. She left clean. He typed back 2. Keep watching. He picked up the divorce document from the table and folded it in half and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his chest. He did not put it in the shredder. He did not sign it. He did not send it anywhere. He simply held it there, against his ribs, and looked at the door through which Luciana had walked with her head high and her hands steady, right up until the moment they weren't. He had been watching her for 3 years. He doubted she had ever noticed. Her room was on the 19th floor, at the end of a corridor that the Vitale building's original architect had clearly intended as a secondary wing, less grand than the floors above, furnished well but without the deliberate statement of the family's main rooms. Luciana had understood, when she was first shown to it 3 years ago, that this placement was itself a message. She was not on the family floors. She was not in the staff quarters. She was somewhere in between, which was, she had come to understand, exactly where the Vitale family had always intended to keep her. The room itself was large and had good light in the mornings and a view of the city that on clear days showed the water. She had made it her own in the small ways available to her: books stacked beside the chair by the window, a photograph of her mother on the dresser. A particular way she arranged her desk that had nothing to do with the room's original furniture plan. These were not decorating choices. They were the markings of someone who has learned to make a territory out of whatever space they are given. She set her bag down on the bed and sat beside it and looked at her hands. The shaking had mostly stopped. Her right palm still held a faint warmth, the physical memory of the slap, and she pressed it flat against her knee and thought about what she had done. She was not sorry. That was the first thing she understood, sitting in the quiet of her room while the building hummed around her with its usual business. She had expected to feel something: regret, perhaps, or fear, or the particular hollowness that followed impulsive actions. What she felt instead was a kind of clarifying stillness, the sensation of a room that has had its windows opened after a long time. She had spent 3 years being careful. She had spent 3 years arranging herself around this family's needs and this marriage's silences and Dante Vitale's absence, which was its own kind of presence, filling the space he left behind with all the things he had never said to her. One slap, and the careful arrangements of 3 years had scattered like papers in a sudden wind, and she found, to her own surprise, that she did not want to pick them all back up. She was still sitting there, her mind circling the morning's events, when someone knocked on her door. She knew before she opened it the quality of the knock. 2 measured beats, no more, carried a particular authority she had come to recognize, even through wood and distance. She stood. She smoothed her jacket with both hands, a habit she had developed early in this marriage as a way of finding something to do with her body when her mind was already occupied. She opened the door. Dante was alone. That itself was unusual. She had never, in 3 years, seen him move through this building without at least one person within range. He stood in the corridor with his hands at his sides and the mark on his jaw still visible, and he looked at her with that same unreadable expression from the boardroom, the one that had no name she could put to it. "May I come in?" he said. It was framed as a question, but the inflection did not quite make it one, which was, she reflected, very consistent with everything else about him. She stepped back and let him in. He did not sit. He stood near the window and looked at the city, the same posture he had taken in the boardroom, and she had the sudden thought that this was how he processed difficulty, by finding a window and putting the world at a distance until he had decided what to do with it. She sat in the chair by the desk, facing him, and waited. She was good at waiting. 3 years had made her excellent at it. "I need you to stay in the building," he said. "For the next several days. I need you not to leave without telling me first." The request landed quietly, and Luciana let it settle before she responded. "Why?" she asked. "I cannot explain all of it right now. Can you explain any of it?" He turned from the window. His jaw was set in the way she had come to understand meant he was choosing words with care, not out of indifference, but out of a precision she had once found cold, and was only now beginning to reconsider. "There are things happening that affect your safety," he said. "That is what I can tell you." "My safety?" She looked at him steadily. "In 3 years, Dante, you have never once spoken to me about my safety. You have spoken to me about family obligations. You have spoken to me about what was expected at dinners, and what I should wear to certain events, and who I should not speak to at length because they were business problems. You have not, in any of those conversations, indicated that my safety was something you thought about at all." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, but she had spent 3 years reading the small movements of this man's face because they were the only information he ever offered, and she caught it. "I'm telling you now," he said. "That is not an answer to what I just said." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird crossed the window's frame and disappeared. "No," he said at last. "It is not." He moved from the window, and for a moment she thought he was going to walk out, end the conversation the way he ended most things with her, through simple absence. Instead, he stopped in the middle of the room, equidistant between the window and the door, as though he could not commit to either direction. "I should have done things differently," he said. "This arrangement, the way it was structured, you deserved to be told more than you were." Luciana felt something shift in her own chest, a loosening of something she had held tight for a long time. She did not let it show. "What do you mean?" "Structured." The word snagged in her mind. "You are talking about our marriage as if it was a filing system." In some ways it was. He said it without apology, which was oddly easier to receive than apology would have been. At least it was honest. It was not only that, but it was not that. "And you have a right to know more than you do." He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the strange sensation of being actually seen by him. Not observed or assessed or catalogued, but seen, in the particular way that requires the person looking to lower some interior shield they have been carrying. "But not tonight, and not here. I need a few days to arrange something. In the meantime, I need you inside this building." She stood. They were close now, closer than they had been in months, closer than she could remember them being with any degree of voluntariness on his part. She could see the mark on his jaw clearly. "A few days," she said. "Yes, and then you will actually tell me what is happening." He held her gaze. "Yes." She thought about it. She thought about the man in the corridor downstairs with the earpiece and the posture of someone paid to watch. She thought about Silvio's eyes at the door, that compass needle look with its precise direction. She thought about 3 years of being kept in the middle of a building and a family and a marriage, and never being told why the middle was where she had to stay. "I want your word," she said. "Not a Vitale family arrangement. Your word." Something moved in his face that she had no category for. "You have it," he said. She nodded. He moved to the door. She thought it was finished. And then she remembered something that had been sitting at the edge of her mind since she woke that morning. A memory that had surfaced for no reason she could identify, and then refused to subside. "Dante." He paused with his hand on the doorframe. 3 years ago, the week before the wedding, I stayed late at the Moretti office building one evening. My father asked me to collect some documents. She watched his back, the precise stillness that moved through him at her words. It was raining. The building was mostly empty. I went up to the top floor, and the elevator opened, and there were 2 men in the corridor, and one of them was on the floor. She paused. I thought it was a medical emergency. I thought he had fainted or had a fall. I went back down and called the front desk, and they told me it had been handled. I never thought about it again until this morning. She kept her voice level. I don't know why it came back to me today. Dante had not turned around. His hand was still on the doorframe. When you remembered it this morning, he said, very carefully. Did you tell anyone? The question was quiet, but the care inside it was not. No, she said. I haven't spoken to anyone this morning except you and your brother. He was still for another moment. Then he said, lock the door after I leave. The deadbolt, not just the handle. He stepped out without looking back, and she heard his footsteps quiet and measured all the way down the corridor until the elevator took him. She stood in the center of her room for a long time. Then she went to the door and threw the deadbolt, as instructed. On her bed, where she had set her bag when she came in, she noticed something she had not noticed before, an envelope, plain white, no name on the front. She had not put it there. She did not pick it up immediately. She looked at it from across the room, at the clean white rectangle lying on her pale blue bedspread, and she had a feeling she could not entirely name. Something between recognition and dread. The sensation of understanding that a story you thought you were passing through has in fact been about you all along. She crossed the room and picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 7 words printed in plain type. You saw what you should not have seen. She did not sleep well. The envelope sat on her desk, where she had moved it after reading it 4 times, as if the repetition might change what it said. She had considered calling Dante. She had picked up her phone twice and set it down again, because she did not yet know what to say, and because there was something in her that needed to sit with the fear before she handed it to someone else to manage. That was a habit she recognized in herself, the long pause before asking for help, the internal audit of whether the need was real enough to justify the asking. She had developed it young, and it had served her in small ways and failed her in large ones, and she had never quite been able to let it go. By morning, she had decided 2 things. The first was that she would tell Dante about the envelope. The second was that she would not do it on his schedule. She would not wait, docile, for him to come to her with his careful word choices and his window-facing silences. She would go to him. She had spent 3 years being brought into rooms when she was needed and walked out of them when she was not, and she was done with the logistics of that arrangement. She dressed carefully. She ate breakfast at the small table by her window, looking at the city going about its Tuesday morning, all the people below whose names were not Vitale and whose lives did not contain divorce documents and plain white envelopes, and men with earpieces standing in the shadows near exits. She envied them briefly and specifically, and then she put the envelope in the inside pocket of her jacket and went to find her husband. He was not on the family floors. She found this out from a young man at the main elevator bank who told her, with the particular discomfort of someone delivering information he was not sure he should deliver, that Mr. Vitale had asked not to be disturbed this morning. I understand, Luciana said pleasantly. Thank you. She turned and walked in the opposite direction, toward the service corridor that ran along the building's north side, which she had discovered in her first year there and which connected, if you knew the right door, to the private stairwell that came out behind the executive offices on the 27th floor. She had learned the building's secondary geography the way she had learned everything else in this marriage, quietly, on her own, without telling anyone she was doing it. The door to the stairwell was unlocked. She took the stairs up 8 floors and came out into the short corridor behind the executive suite. And she was 3 steps from the office door when a man stepped out of an alcove to her left and stopped her with a single quiet word, wait. He was not Vitale security. She recognized that now. The particular difference between the men she had seen for 3 years and this man, something in how he held himself, the type of watchfulness that did not carry the Vitale family's brand of performative authority. He was in his 30s, with a forgettable face designed for looking like part of a room, and he looked at her with an expression that was professionally neutral and privately very interested. Miss Vitale, he said, I am going to need to ask you to hold here for just a moment. You are not Vitale security, she said. A very small pause. No. Then, I am going to need you to explain who you are before I hold anywhere." He reached into his jacket, slowly and with the careful deliberateness of someone who was aware of how the gesture might be read, and produced a credentials folder. She looked at it. Federal. The name on it was Agent Marcus Webb, and the badge was real. She had seen enough Vitale security credentials over 3 years to know the texture of the real ones. She looked up at him. "How long have you been in this building?" she asked. "That is something we can discuss with Mr. Vitale present," he said. "If you will allow me to let him know you are here." She waited in the corridor, arms folded, while Webb spoke quietly into his earpiece. The stairwell door behind her was still faintly ajar, a thin line of grey air from the shaft, and she thought about what it meant that a federal agent was standing in an alcove outside her husband's private office on the morning after she had received an anonymous letter in a locked room. She thought about the shape this was beginning to take, the outline of something she had been standing inside without knowing it. The way you could be in a room for 3 years and only now realize the walls were not where you thought they were. The office door opened. Dante stood in the frame, and behind him she could see another man in the room who had the same quality as Webb, the same professional neutrality, the same watchful stillness that had nothing to do with the Vitale family. Dante looked at her, and for once his expression was not managed. She had surprised him. Something about that. The small human fact of having surprised this man settled in her chest like ballast. "You found the back stairs," he said. "I found them 2 years ago." She reached into her jacket and took out the envelope and held it toward him. "Someone put this in my room yesterday, on my bed, while I was in this building, with the door locked." He took the envelope. He read the letter. He looked at Webb. Something passed between them that had the quality of a conversation they had been expecting to have but had hoped to have later. "Come in," Dante said to her. The office was larger than she expected. The furniture pushed to the walls to make space for a folding table covered in documents and photographs and printed pages. She did not try to read from a distance. The second agent, a woman who introduced herself as Agent Carla Reyes, nodded at her from across the room. Luciana sat in the chair, Dante indicated, near the window, and she looked at the table of documents and then at her husband, and she said, "Tell me what I am looking at." Dante sat across from her, not behind the desk, which was pushed to one side, but in a chair that put them at the same level, the same distance from the table and its contents. She noticed this. "6 months ago," he said, "I made contact with the federal task force that Agents Webb and Reyes are part of. I provided them with documentation regarding my brother's activities over the past 4 years. He paused. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "Silvio has been building a structure inside this family that is not, in any legal sense, part of the family's legitimate business. He has been doing it for a long time, and he has been very careful. And the one thing he has not been able to account for is a witness." The word landed between them. Luciana felt it touch something in her memory. The rainy evening and the empty corridor and the man on the floor who she had assumed was a medical emergency. "The man I saw," she said. "His name was Thomas Carver. He was a federal informant." Dante's voice was level, which took effort. She could see the effort it took, the muscle of it. Silvio arranged for him to be met at the Moretti building because it was neutral ground, not associated with the Vitale name at the time. Nobody expected a witness, especially not one who would walk in, decide it was a medical situation, report it to the front desk, and then go home and not think about it again for 3 years. Luciana was quiet for a long moment. "I thought he had fainted," she said. "I know. I called the front desk. I know. They were paid to forget the call." She looked at him. She looked at the table with its documents, at Webb standing near the door, at Reyes making a note on something. She looked at the whole careful architecture of the past 3 years. which she was now understanding had been built around a single moment on a rainy evening when she had stepped off an elevator at the wrong time. "The marriage," she said. Her voice stayed even. She was proud of that. "You married me to keep me inside a Vitale building. I married you to keep you alive." He said it simply, without the particular care he usually brought to words, and the simplicity of it was its own kind of blow. Silvio learned there had been a witness within the first month. He could not identify who. "I knew it was you before he did, because I had access to the building's access logs and I cross-referenced the timing." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, the posture of a man who has been carrying something heavy and is now setting it down in front of another person and waiting to see what they do with it. "If you had been a Moretti, an ordinary person with an ordinary name and address, you would not have survived the year. Inside a Vitale marriage, with Vitale protection around you, you were untouchable, even from Silvio, who could not move against you without moving against me." Agent Webb cleared his throat. "Mrs. Vitale, I want to say that Mr. Vitale's cooperation with our investigation has been genuine and significant. The arrangement he made, the one he is describing, was his own condition for that cooperation. He refused to move forward with us until your protection was secured." Luciana looked at her husband. She looked at the man she had spent 3 years believing saw her as furniture, us, as a paid debt, wearing a ring. She looked at him and felt something enormous and complicated move through her, too large and too tangled to name. Grief and anger and something else she was not ready to call anything yet. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes." He did not look away. "I should have. I have been living in this building, in that room, believing." She stopped. She was not going to finish that sentence. Not here. Not in front of 2 federal agents. Not before she had sat alone with what she now knew and understood what she actually felt about it. She stood up. "I need some time," she said. "Luciana." He stood too. "I am not leaving the building." She picked up her jacket from the chair's arm. "I gave you my word I would not. And I keep my word even when other people do not keep theirs." She looked at him one more time. A long look with everything in it. All 3 years, and all the silences, and the separate floors, and the dinners where she had sat across from this man, and believed he did not see her. And she walked to the door. She was in the corridor outside when she heard Dante say to Webb, quietly, "She is going to need protection on the 19th floor. Double it." A pause. Then, "And make sure she knows the offer was hers to refuse. I need her to know that part." She kept walking, but she heard it. She gave herself the afternoon. She sat in her room with the deadbolt thrown and the city in the window and thought about Thomas Carver, a man whose name she had not known until an hour ago and whose death she had witnessed without knowing she was witnessing it. She thought about the front desk clerk at the Moretti building, paid to forget a phone call. She thought about her father, who had brought her into this marriage with the particular relief of a man setting down a debt, and who she now understood had known, at some level, that the debt he was settling was heavier than he had told her. She did not cry. She had cried for this marriage in its first year, quietly, in the bathroom, with the shower running, and she had decided at some point that she had spent enough of herself on grief that had not yet been formally invited. What she felt now was something colder and more clarifying, the sensation of a picture coming into focus after 3 years of looking at a blur and calling it a portrait. What she could not yet resolve was what it meant. She had been protected without being told she needed protecting. She had spent 3 years in a cage that was also a shelter, and she did not know whether the gratitude she felt was supposed to arrive before or after the anger, or whether both were allowed to exist at the same time without cancelling each other out. She was still working on this when her phone rang. She looked at Silvio's number for 2 rings before answering, curious what he would say now that she understood the shape of things. Luciana. His voice was pleasant, carrying the warmth he deployed strategically. The warmth of a man who had decided pleasantness was a more useful tool than force in most situations. I hope you are feeling better than yesterday. The morning was difficult for everyone. A pause. Calibrated. I wonder if you would be willing to have a conversation with me. Just family. I feel there are things that should be said between us before this process moves forward, and I would prefer to say them in person. What kind of conversation? She asked. The honest kind. He let the words sit there, and she heard in it the particular irony of a man who had spent years building an architecture of deception, offering her honesty as a gift. There is a private room on the ground floor, the one with the garden view. I will be there in 20 minutes. If you are willing. She looked at the locked door. She thought about Dante's instruction, and the word she had given him. She also thought about the fact that Silvio had not called her directly in 3 years, and that whatever he wanted to say in a private room was information she needed before she could understand what came next. She called Dante's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, which was unusual enough that she felt the edges of it as a warning. She left a brief message telling him where she was going and why, which she believed discharged the letter of the promise she had made, even if not its spirit, and she put on her jacket and went downstairs. The room with the garden view was on the building's south side, a small, formal parlor that had been used, in the years before she arrived, for meetings that did not need to be on record. Silvio was already there when she arrived, standing near the window with his hands in his pockets, and he looked up when she entered with an expression she was now reading differently than she would have yesterday, not warmth, but the performance of it, the face of a man who had decided what outcome he needed and was choosing the right instrument for the job. Sit down, he said. She did not sit down. She stood near the door and looked at him across the room and waited. Something shifted in his posture. He was a man who preferred to run the temperature of a room, and she had just declined to be run. He adjusted. You spoke with Dante this morning, he said. It was not a question. Yes, and he told you things. He moved away from the window and sat in one of the chairs himself, which was a concession. She understood. A repositioning. I imagine he framed them in a particular way. He was straightforward with me. Dante is many things. Silvio crossed one leg over the other, unhurried. The posture of a man who believed time was on his side. Straightforward is not usually among them. He is a strategist. Luciana, he has been running a strategy since before you ever entered this family, and you are part of it. I want you to understand that clearly, because I think you deserve to know what role you are actually playing. I know what role I have been playing, she said. I learned about it this morning. Did you? He looked at her. Then you know that my brother has been building a case against me for the better part of a year, using you as a piece on the board. He let that sit. He did not marry you because he cared about your safety. He married you because a living witness he could control was more useful than a dead one he could not. If you had died 3 years ago, Luciana, the investigation dies with you. He needed you alive and contained. The marriage was the container. The words were designed to land like blows, and they did land. In the places where she was still sore from the morning's conversation, the places where she had not yet finished deciding what she felt. She felt them. She did not let him see her feel them. You are describing my husband as someone who used me, she said. You are doing this because you believe I am angry enough to be useful to you. Silvio was very still. I am angry, she continued. I want to be clear about that. I am angry about 3 years of silence and managed distances and being kept in the 19th floor like a piece of evidence in storage. She took to step into the room, toward him. But I am standing here looking at the man who had Thomas Carver killed in a corridor 3 years ago and who has spent every moment since hoping the witness who saw it would stay quiet or disappear. And I am trying to understand why I would find that man more trustworthy than the one who at least kept me breathing. The room changed. The pleasantness left Silvio's face the way a tide leaves a beach, completely and fast, and what was underneath it was something she had known existed but had never seen directly. He stood up. "You need to think very carefully," he said, "about what you are saying and to whom." "I have been thinking carefully for 3 years." Her voice was steady. The fear was there, underneath, but it was not in her voice. "It is all I have had to do." The door behind her opened. She did not turn around immediately. She heard footsteps, more than one person, and then Dante's voice, very quiet, from somewhere to her left, step away from her. Silvio looked past her at his brother, and she watched his face go through several calculations in rapid succession, the assessments of a man working out how much has been seen and heard, and from where, and arriving at an answer he did not like. 2 more people entered from the corridor, and she recognized Agent Webb, and beside him Agent Reyes with a document in her hand and the particular expression of a person who has been waiting a long time for a specific moment and has now arrived at it. "Silvio Vitale," Webb said. "We have a warrant." What happened next was orderly in the way that prepared things are orderly, each person moving to a position they had already rehearsed. And Luciana stood in the center of it and watched Silvio's face as he understood that the room had been arranged around him, the way rooms had been arranged around her for 3 years, by someone who had decided in advance what the outcome would be and built the walls accordingly. He looked at her once, a last sharp look, and she held it without flinching. And then he looked at Dante. "You built this on her," Silvio said, not to the agents, to Dante. "I built it on what you did," Dante said. "She just survived it." Silvio was walked out. The agents followed. The room was quiet. Dante stood a few feet from her, and she looked at him, this man who had arranged 3 years of her life without telling her, who had kept her alive through a method she had not consented to and had not been asked to consent to, who had, she now knew, refused to move forward with a federal investigation until her protection was in place, and who had not told her any of it because he was, at his core, a man who believed that control was the only reliable form of care. "You got my voicemail," she said. "I got it before you sent it." He held up his phone briefly. Webb had eyes on the floor. "When Silvio called you, we moved. You were already coming." Yes, she absorbed this. She looked at the garden through the window, the small square of green that the building kept behind glass, and she thought about all the ways a person could be protected without being seen. "Did you ever?" she said, and then she stopped and took a breath and tried again. "Did you ever see me as anything other than a piece on your board?" He did not answer immediately. He crossed the room and stood beside her, not quite facing her, both of them looking at the garden, and she thought that this was, in the end, very Dante, to stand adjacent to a hard question rather than in front of it. "In the beginning," he said at last, "I told myself the arrangement was clean. You were safe. The investigation could proceed. I had discharged a debt to someone who could not protect themselves. A pose. That was what I told myself for the first 6 months." He turned then and looked at her directly, which was something he did rarely, and which, when he did it, had the quality of a door opening. "The morning you sat at the dinner table with my mother, and my mother said something about your weight. The way she said it, and you put your fork down and answered her in exactly the same tone she had used, and then picked your fork back up and went on eating. I thought, this is not a person who needs protecting. This is a person I have put in a situation that does not deserve her." He held her gaze. "I did not know what to do with that. So I kept doing what I had been doing. That is the truest thing I can tell you." She looked at him for a long time. The anger was still there. It was going to be there for a while. She understood. Because it was the right response to the right facts, and it would not leave until she had done something real with it. But underneath it, or beside it, or somewhere in the same space without cancelling it out, was something else. The thing she had not had a category for in 3 years. The thing that had no clean name because it had been growing without permission in the dark. The way things grow when they are not given the conditions they need, but grow anyway. "You should have told me," she said. "I know." He said it without excuse. Without the architecture of justification he usually brought to everything. Just 2 words. Quiet and final. The most honest thing he had ever said to her. "I know." 2 weeks passed. The Vitale name moved through the news cycle the way large names do when they are attached to criminal proceedings with a particular momentum that felt inevitable in retrospect and shocking in the moment. The story breaking on a Wednesday and spreading by Thursday, and settling by the following week into the kind of ongoing coverage that becomes background noise. Silvio Vitale, described as a senior figure in the Vitale family's operational structure, had been taken into federal custody. The charges were extensive. The family's lawyers were doing what family lawyers do. None of this, as far as the public reporting was concerned, had anything to do with Luciana Moretti Vitale, whose name appeared nowhere in any of the initial coverage, because Dante had made that a condition of his cooperation, and because Agent Webb had honored it. She watched the coverage from her room on the 19th floor, where she had remained by choice, not by instruction, which was a distinction she had started paying attention to. She had spoken to Agent Reyes twice, brief and procedural conversations about the shape of her testimony and what the process would look like. She had spoken to her father once, a call she had initiated and kept short, because she had questions for him that she was not ready to ask yet and did not want to ask in the wrong order. She had not spoken to Dante. That was not entirely accurate. They had passed in the corridor once, on the 3rd day, and he had looked at her, and she had looked at him, and they had both arrived at the unspoken agreement that the timing was not right, that the thing between them needed more room than a corridor offered. She had nodded. He had nodded back. It had been, she reflected later, the most honest exchange they had managed in 3 years. She spent the 2 weeks doing something she had not allowed herself to do inside this marriage, thinking about what she actually wanted, not what was expected, not what was owed, not what the correct response to a situation was, what she wanted. It was harder than she expected. She had arranged herself around other people's needs for long enough that her own preferences had gone quiet, politely waiting for a turn that never came. And she had to sit with the silence for a while before they started speaking up again. She read books she had been putting aside. She slept later than she had in 3 years. She ate meals at times that had nothing to do with family schedules or formal dinners. These were small things. They were also not small things. What her preferences said, when they finally did speak, surprised her with its clarity. On the 14th day, she went to the legal offices on the 23rd floor and asked to see the family's documentation regarding the terms of her marriage contract and what dissolution would look like. The lawyer, a composed woman named Miriam, who had dealt with Vitale family matters for 15 years and had long since stopped being surprised by anything, set the relevant documents in front of her without comment and let her read. She read for an hour. She asked 3 questions. Then she asked for a notary. The document she signed was not the divorce agreement that had been on the boardroom table 2 weeks ago, the one Silvio had prepared. It was a different document. One she had asked Miriam to draft according to her own specifications, a formal renunciation of all claims to Vitale family assets, properties, and holdings, leaving her with nothing she had not brought into the marriage herself. Miriam had raised one eyebrow at this. Luciana had explained, briefly, that she did not want to spend the next several years of her life tethered to a legal proceeding over money that had never felt like hers. Miriam had accepted this with the professional equanimity of someone who had learned not to argue with the people who signed things. The notary was a young man who smelled of coffee and watched the proceedings with wide eyes and the air of someone storing an anecdote. Luciana signed where she was asked to sign, and initialed where she was asked to initial, and thanked Miriam, and took the elevator down. She was crossing the lobby when she saw him. Dante was standing near the building's main entrance, not in a business suit, which was unusual enough that it registered before anything else. He was in a dark jacket and ordinary clothes. The kind of clothes a person wore when they were not presenting themselves as anything in particular, and he was holding a phone he was not looking at. He was looking at the elevator bank. He had been waiting for her. She understood, which meant he had known she was in the legal offices, which meant Miriam had told him, which meant she was going to have a conversation with Miriam about what client confidentiality looked like in practice. He fell into step beside her when she reached the lobby floor, not ahead of her, not steering her, just present and moving in the same direction. She let him. They walked through the lobby together and out through the main doors into the September afternoon, and the air outside had the particular quality of late-season warmth, the kind that knows it is almost finished and is making the most of what remains. They stood on the steps for a moment. The city was doing what it always did, indifferent and continuous, and she thought about all the times she had looked at it through glass and envied the people in it, their ordinary lives. Standing in it felt different than she expected. "Miriam called you," she said. "She mentioned you were there." He looked at the street. "She did not tell me what you signed." "I renounced the assets." He was quiet for a moment. "That was not necessary. It was necessary to me." She turned and looked at him, this man with the careful face and the unreadable eyes who had, she now knew, spent 3 years building a wall around her without her knowledge, and who had also spent 3 years, according to his own admission, revising what he thought about who she was. "I did not want the legal proceeding. I did not want years of argument about money that never felt like mine." She looked back at the street. "I want to know who I am when I am not defined by what I survived in this building." He nodded. He did not argue, which she respected. He understood, she thought, the difference between what he wanted and what she needed, and he was choosing to hold his preference back. That was new, or perhaps it was not new and she was only now able to see it. "What happens now?" she asked. Not for herself, asking about the case, the family, the pieces he would spend the next months and possibly years putting back into a shape that could function. "The family restructures," he said. "There are people inside the organization who were loyal to Silvio and people who were not, and sorting them out will take time. The legitimate businesses can continue. The other things will be wound down." A pause. "It is not the worst outcome." "It is not," she agreed. They were quiet for a while. The afternoon moved around them, and she felt the warmth of it on her face, and thought, this is what the outside feels like. She had been inside for 2 weeks. Before that, 3 years of inside in a different sense. She was acquainting herself with the sensation of unmanaged air. Luciana. His voice was different from usual. Not careful. Not managed. Just his voice. Without the architecture. "I would like the chance to do this correctly." She did not answer immediately. She thought about what correctly meant, in his vocabulary and in hers, and whether those 2 definitions could be reconciled, and what it would cost both of them to find out. She thought about the man who had built a shelter and called it a marriage and had not known how to say, "I am doing this because I cannot think of another way to keep you safe." She thought about what 3 years of watching from a careful distance did to a person, and whether it could be undone, and whether she had the appetite for the undoing. She did not know. That was the truest thing. She was 31 years old and had spent 3 years of her life inside a story she had not been shown the whole of. And she was standing on the steps of the building that had contained her, in the open air, and she did not yet know what she wanted the next sentence to be. She looked at him. He was watching her with that expression she had no name for, the one that had appeared in the boardroom and had not entirely left his face since. The one that looked like a man who has stopped managing what he shows and started simply showing it. "Ask me again," she said. "In 6 months." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that she thought might be, for the first time in 3 years, uncomplicated. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter. The expression of a man who had been handed a possibility and understood it was the most he was owed and more than he had earned. 6 months, he said. She nodded. She stepped down from the last step onto the pavement, and she walked in the direction of the street and the city in the ordinary afternoon, and she did not look back, but she was smiling, just slightly, in a way she did not try to explain or contain. She thought 6 months is enough time to figure out what I want. She kept walking,